What we eat, the true story of why we put sugar in our coffee and ketchup on our fries. Originally, all life that lived on land lived on one giant continent. Then forces inside the Earth started breaking that landmass into the continents we have today and pushing them apart. Slightly over 500 years ago, a counterforce appeared and started pulling everything back together. Only this time it wasn't a geological force, it was the force of human culture, and the point man was Christopher Columbus. During the 10 years between Columbus's first voyage in 1492 and his final trip in 1502, new forces totally changed the course of history. Millions of people moved from one continent to another. Governments changed and religions were exported. But surprisingly, the most important changes were not the result of politics or religion. They were the result of plants and animals being exchanged between two worlds.
We call them the Old World and the New World. But I think what we really had were two old worlds. After all, people have been living in the Americas for 35,000 years. Even to a man my age, that's a considerable length of time. I think what Columbus did was introduce the two old worlds and in the process create one new one. And the exchange of plants and animals that took place altered the way people ate. And that changed everything on the planet. What our series does is look at those changes and how they continue to affect our lives every day in ways you wouldn't imagine. In 1502, Columbus set sail on his fourth and final voyage. As usual, he was trying to get to Asia. He believed that the islands of the Caribbean were just offshore from China and Japan. Poor guy, he never had a clue.
On this last voyage, his first landfall was in the Bay Islands, about 30 miles north of Honduras. As his ship sat at anchor, the crew saw a tremendous dugout canoe. Columbus's son Ferdinand reported that he saw a ship as long as a Venetian galley with a cargo of almond-like beans, which the natives valued so highly that when one dropped, they all stooped to pick it up as if an eye had fallen. It was a Maya trading canoe, about 150 feet long, and carrying a cargo of cacao beans. Columbus was the first European to come in contact with the source of chocolate, and as usual, he had no idea of what he was looking at. The Maya dominated the east coast of Central America from 250 to 900 AD. Their culture, art, and architecture were on the level with that of ancient Greece and Renaissance Italy. And they were great chocolate masters. The Maya had a written language and often wrote about chocolate. In a Maya book which predates the arrival of the Spanish, there are seated gods holding cacao pods and dishes filled with cacao beans. The text states that cacao is to be offered during the New Year celebrations. Cacao pods also appear on carved vessels that were placed in the graves of important members of Maya society. An illustration on an 8th century vase from northern Guatemala shows a Maya king seated on his throne. Below him, a vase for chocolate drinks. Women poured chocolate from one jar to another, creating a foam on top, which was the most desirable part of the beverage. Chocolate drinks played an important part in Maya gatherings and celebrations.
The Maya, we have some evidence for this, used it to cement marriage relationships when they were negotiating for a bride, let's say, a major Maya king or ruler or chief or big chief of some sort or another would throw a feast at which cacao in the form of frothy chocolate was brought out, and they drank this, and that cemented this particular relationship. So it was used during negotiations of all sorts among the Maya.
The Aztecs picked up the use of chocolate and cacao from the Maya, and they worshipped the god who gave chocolate to the world.
I think the Aztecs had the same approach to chocolate as the Mayas did. It wasn't a drink for ordinary people. It was a drink for the elite, for the, as it became later on in Europe, for the top echelons of society. This included the nobility, the king and his retinue, the palace, the great warriors were allowed to drink chocolate. It was only in a drink, not in solid form. They had some really good reporters there in the way of Spanish priests who told us all about their lives. And we know that among them, chocolate had almost a sanctified aspect to it. In fact, it was conceived symbolically as human blood. And so it really was like communion wine in many respects.
The Aztecs flavored the chocolate drink with allspice, vanilla, honey, chilies, corn, and flowers. In the Mexican state of Tabasco, I found a family still using the ancient recipe. They started by grinding corn with an almost modern hand grinder. Cacao beans are ground on a stone metate. This method of grinding has been around for over 5,000 years. The ground corn and the ground chocolate are mixed together. Water is added and the mixing continues. Then the solids are sieved off, the liquid is poured up and back a dozen times, and the chocolate is ready to drink.
When the Spaniards first came to Mexico, and they saw people drinking chocolate and were offered it and tried it, they thought it was horrible. In fact, one of our sources, who was an Italian traveling with him, says it was only basically fit for pigs. It was so bad. It was bitter. They didn't like the color of it. It made your mouth black, or if they mixed it up with a spice called achiote, which is red, it made your mouth look red and dyed your lips. They thought it was the most disgusting stuff. It wasn't until later that they realized how good it was.
The first person to call the Americas the New World was an Italian living in Spain. In 1516, he wrote a book called The New World. It described the events that were taking place in Mexico and the Caribbean, including the use of cacao beans as currency.
He called their money happy money because they did not pull the earth apart searching for gold and silver the way the Spanish did. Their happy money grew on trees. The Spanish adopted cacao beans as currency to trade with the Maya, but the beans traveled back to Spain for a different purpose. European medical theories of the 15th and 16th centuries were primitive. The Native Americans had a much more advanced system based on their extensive knowledge of plants and their use to effect real cures. When word of the New World's pharmacy reached King Philip II of Spain, he sent his royal physician, Francisco Hernandez, to Mexico. And even though cacao was not used by Native Americans as a medicine, Hernandez included it in his bag of cures. Hernandez, in a letter to the king, pointed out that the cacao seed is nourishing and good in hot weather to cure fevers. When pepper is added, it has an agreeable taste, warming the stomach and perfuming the breath. It combats poisons and alleviates intestinal pains. He also mentioned that it excites the sexual appetite. The cacao bean finally made its debut and was presented to European royalty in 1544. The Dominican friars, who were among the first and most energetic missionaries in the Americas, took a delegation of Mayan nobles to visit Prince Philip in Spain. Among the gifts they brought were bowls of chocolate. This was opening day for chocolate in Europe, but it would be 40 years before regular shipments started to arrive.
The original problem was that chocolate beans come from Mexico. They're bitter, they don't have such a great smell, and they don't have any of the obvious potential that the Europeans developed in it when they brought it back to Mexico. They learned to dry it, to ferment it, to roast it, to mix it with various things, including vanilla, and then, of course, to bring out that fat by heating in a complex way. And then, of course, it was a little bitter, but then when they got the sugar from the sugar cane, they added that. And then, of course, sometimes later milk. So they created, through a very complex technology, a food that appeals ideally to humans and is totally different from its origin. So it's basically designed in its texture, in its taste, in its aroma, and in its caloric load to be an ideal food.
In 1660, Maria Theresa, daughter of the King of Spain, married Louis XIV, King of France. The new queen loved chocolate, but the king did not. And so she sipped her chocolate in private. Within 10 years, though, in spite of Louis's opinion, drinking chocolate became popular with the French upper class. Louis XVI granted a royal monopoly for chocolate. In France, chocolate was tightly controlled by a centralized authority and was only available to the aristocracy. In pre-Spanish times, the Mesoamericans poured the chocolate liquid from one jar to another in order to produce the desired foam, a time-consuming process. In the 16th century, the Spanish colonists introduced the molinillo, a wooden utensil that they placed into a pot and twirled between their hands.
She's making chocolate con leche.
Hot chocolate milk.
Well, it is. It's actually considered the most ritualistic, the most incredible drink you can give somebody here. It's Mexico's gift to the world.
That's milk?
It's milk with chocolate.
Chocolate melted in it and then whipped up.
And the foam is considered the most important part of the drink.
The French covered the pot with a lid and made a hole in the top for the molinillo. It quickly became the preferred way of making the foam. Chocolate traveled from one royal court to another as a medicine, but it soon became appreciated for its taste and its stimulating effect on the nervous system. A medicine with a curative power converted to recreational use.
So chocolate became a health food, but there was still one more barrier it had to pass before it became fully accepted, and that was ecclesiastical. The problem was the Catholic Church couldn't decide whether chocolate was a medicine, which could be taken at any time, or a food, which would not be allowed during periods of fasting.
The Society of Jesus, the official name of the Jesuits, was founded in 1534 and was the militant arm of the Church, zealous defenders of the Pope's supremacy. They maintained a tightly controlled worldwide organization. In 1650, they prohibited Jesuits from drinking chocolate, but quickly rescinded the decision when students started leaving the seminary.
Once it had been decided by the ecclesiastical authorities that chocolate did not break the fast, in other words, during Lent and times like that, you could take chocolate because it was not considered a food. Once that was done, then the Jesuits went into high gear, and they had a big commercial operation with cacao, growing cacao commercially through much of Latin America, where, you know, the Latin American tropics where the stuff would grow. They drank a lot of it themselves, too. They were big chocolate imbibers, but they definitely shipped a lot of chocolate back and made a lot of money from the New World into the Old World. A big shipment came into the main Spanish port, which was Cadiz in Spain. And it was so heavy, these crates, that supposedly contained chocolate, that the porters could barely carry them. And finally, the authorities demanded that they be opened up and this so-called chocolate inspected. And they looked at these huge bars of chocolate, which weighed a tremendous amount. It turned out that there was about a finger's width of chocolate on the outside of that coating, solid gold bars. This was smuggling of the first degree, because all gold belonged to the crown, not to the Jesuits or the church or anybody else. So they had been breaking crown law. And the upshot of that was that it was confiscated, the gold was, and they gave the chocolate to the porters.
Chocolate's rich and intense flavor made it an ideal medium for poison, and assassins put it to regular use. My favorite story in this regard is about a group of Spanish noblewomen who lived in Mexico in the 1600s. They would bring chocolate to church. The bishop was infuriated and threatened to excommunicate anyone who drank chocolate in church. The women were unhappy, but equally unrepentant, and they had the bishop poisoned. Of course, the poison was delivered to the bishop's lips in a cup of chocolate. In 1655, English troops took the island of Jamaica from the Spanish. Cacao beans had been a big business on Jamaica, and the English quickly realized both the gastronomic and economic significance of the crop. Jamaica became England's primary source for the cacao bean.
Chocolate, coffee, tea, and sugar all entered England at the same time and at the highest social levels. But that soon changed. Unlike France, England was a nation of shopkeepers. And when chocolate came into the country, anybody who could afford to buy a cup of chocolate could have it. The rising middle class began to drink chocolate in houses that were hotbeds of political debate.
During the middle of the 1600s, Dr. Henry Stubbs was England's leading authority on chocolate, and in fact regularly prepared chocolate for King Charles II. Like most of his contemporaries in England and on the continent, Stubbs thought that chocolate was an aphrodisiac. At one point, he published an essay on chocolate's erotic properties, which of course sent chocolate sales through the bedroom roof.
Chocolate comes from the cacao tree, which is difficult to grow, uncooperative, and moody. It refuses to bear fruit unless it's growing inside a narrow strip of land near the equator. It demands moisture throughout the year, and the temperature must never fall below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Among the short cacao trees, you will find large shade trees that protect the cacao from too much direct sun or wind. The cacao tree is one of the world's most inefficient biological systems. Each tree will produce hundreds of flowers, but only 1 to 3% of them will bear fruit. And the tree will take about 3 years to get around to that. The small flowers are pollinated exclusively by little bugs that live on the forest floor. A worker moves between the trees, cutting the roots of any plant that might compete with the cacao. Disturbing the leaves on the ground also increases the activity of the bugs that pollinate the leaves. After 4 or 5 months, each pollinated flower will produce a large pod containing 30 to 40 almond-shaped seeds or beans surrounded by a sweet pulp.
The plant can't even open its own pods. It depends on squirrels, small monkeys, and large monkeys, also known as human beings, to disperse its seeds. The squirrels and the monkeys steal the pods and open them up because they love the white, sweet connective tissue. They throw away the bitter beans.
Workers split the pods to get to the seeds in the surrounding pulp. The two are allowed to sit and ferment together for 5 or 6 days. The pulp becomes liquid and drains away. sacks of the seeds are sent to ferment for about 4 days. Each day they are turned. When they arrived, they were still covered with some of the white connective tissue from the pod. As they ferment, they begin to turn brown. To stop the fermentation, the seeds, which are now called beans, are dried. They can be dried in the factory in long concrete bins. Often hot air is blown over them by machines. Or they can be dried in the traditional way by being spread out on canvas mats in the sun. Either way, after they're dried, they're bagged and shipped to a chocolate factory. When they arrive at the factory, they are roasted and toasted. Then the outside shell is removed. What remains is called a nib. The remaining nib is ground to a paste in a machine that works like a giant food processor. The liquid that comes out is called cacao liquor. The cacao liquor goes into a cylinder where it's put under enormous pressure. The liquid that comes out of the press is called cocoa butter and is separated from the solids, which are called cocoa. In 1823, Conrad van Houten, a Dutch chemist, invented this process. It's called Dutching, and it removes most of the fat from the chocolate solids.
The old thick and foamy drink was replaced by a much more digestible and easier to make cocoa. And thanks to Van Houten's invention, manufacturers were able to produce an affordable chocolate.
One of the special things about chocolate is that it's the only natural fat that melts at body temperature. So it gives you that experience of it's solid in your mouth, and then it just melts into velvet in your mouth. And nothing else like that. There's a lot of people trying to get a non-nutritive fat that does that. But at the moment, chocolate is the queen of fat.
In 1848, an Englishman blended cocoa powder, sugar, and melted cocoa butter and produced a paste that was poured into a mold. The world's first formed chocolate.
Up until World War I, there was really no such thing as a candy bar. So how did this happen? Well, when the soldiers were drafted to fight in Europe during the war, the military realized that they needed some kind of energy food to give to the warriors to help them fight, to help them stay, battle ready, and it needed to be light and small and easy to carry, but it had to pack a lot of calories. Well, they turned to the candy industry and they said, what can you come up with? And before you knew it, during that first war, every candy company in America was churning out bite-sized, individually wrapped pieces that the soldiers could take with them into the battlefield.
Since the end of the 1800s, Switzerland has dominated the world of chocolate. Today, its citizens are the #1 consumers, averaging almost 12 pounds of chocolate per person per year. Now, the only thing the Swiss enjoy as much as money and chocolate are the cows that give them some of the world's finest milk. In 1879, Henry Nestle, a Swiss chemist who developed powdered milk, combined forces with Daniel Peter, a Swiss chocolate maker, and they produced the world's first milk chocolate.
Milk is a water-based substance. Chocolate, a fat-based substance. We all know that oil and water don't mix. So getting milk and chocolate to blend together in a way that was smooth and edible was a very, very difficult process. But Mr. Peter was an expert in milk products, and he realized that if he took dried milk, having removed the water, then added it to the chocolate liqueur and the cocoa butter, and then introduced the water again later in the process, he could get a smooth and creamy chocolate. All of a sudden, you had a product that not only tasted better, but more and more people could afford.
Chocolate is an alkaloid, And like all alkaloids, it will stimulate the nervous system. It also contains small amounts of caffeine. But how the caffeine will affect you is a function of your individual tolerance as well as your cultural beliefs. If you think a cup of chocolate will wake you up, it probably will.
If you believed it would be soothing, it probably will be. A chocolate drink with foam on top, just the way the Maya served it 1,000 years ago. The Latin word for the cacao tree translates into English as food of the gods. That's pretty good, because a lot of us believe that chocolate is heavenly. For What We Eat, I'm Burt Wolf. On 2 occasions, the potato changed the course of world history. The first time is when it supplied the primary source of energy for the great Inca Empire and the Spanish colonists that conquered them. The second time is when the potato fed an expanding population in Europe, which allowed a few small northern European nations to dominate the rest of the world, which they did for over 200 years.
It looks like the potato was first cultivated in the Andean mountains of South America about 7,000 years ago. The great centers of pre-Inca culture were high up, some as high as 12,500 feet above sea level. And each night, the temperature would drop below freezing. Edible crops were in short supply, but the potato was one of the few crops that could be grown at high altitudes. The Andean farmers came to rely on the potato. They also found an ingenious way of preserving them.
Raw potatoes don't store very well, but by squeezing out their moisture and exposing them to the cold night air, Andean farmers were able to produce freeze-dried potatoes, and they stored them in giant underground vaults where they held their nutrients for many years. Now, potatoes are packed with nutrients, and except for calcium and vitamins A and D, they'll give you enough stuff to live on for quite a few years.
The Inca government collected the freeze-dried potatoes as tribute, kept them in warehouses, and distributed them to workers who were employed on official projects. In 1545, Spanish colonists discovered silver in what is now southern Bolivia. Thousands of Incan laborers were forced to work the mines. And inexpensive food was needed to keep them alive, so the Spanish adopted the Incas' use of the freeze-dried potato. The potato fed the workers, who in turn fed the world's appetite for precious metal.
The silver that came out of the South American mines flooded the world. In Europe, it allowed Philip II of Spain to pay for his imperial fleets and his imperial armies that sailed on them. Windfall lasted for about 100 years, and then the ore ran out, and so did much of Spain's power. A second effect of all of that silver floating around was massive inflation. Without an Alan Greenspan around to control the situation, prices began to rise, and both the moral and economic standings of the countries began to change. People who were fabulously wealthy became incredibly poor, and people who were incredibly poor became fabulously wealthy.
But in the end, it wasn't the silver that would prove most valuable to Europeans. It was the potato. At first, Spanish settlers looked down on the potato and relied on corn. The potato, however, did catch on with sailors who recognized that eating potatoes prevented scurvy. The first potatoes to reach Europe traveled on Spanish ships returning from South America. Spain introduced the potato to the rest of Europe. For most of the 16th century, parts of northern Italy and the Netherlands were under Spanish rule. The route used by Spanish troops to connect these two imperial provinces became known as the Spanish Road. Potatoes took root in peasant gardens all along its path. In those days, armies were expected to supply themselves with food from the countryside in which they were operating. Stores of grain piled up in barns were easy pickings. Wherever the local population depended on stored grain for their survival, starvation was the usual and expected result of any major military campaign.
One of the reasons that potatoes were so popular with peasants along the Spanish Road is that they realized that the potato growing underground could help protect them from the ruthless requisitioning of the soldiers moving above ground. During the 16th and 17th centuries, soldiers loved pillaging. I mean, it was in keeping with their sense of who they were. It had style. But digging potatoes out of the ground with a shovel, I mean, after all, that's embarrassing. There's the image of the uniform that has to be upheld.
The story of potatoes arriving in Europe is a very interesting one. They were taken up early in Germany and in the British Isles, not just in Ireland. The French were very loath to try them. It didn't look like anything they were used to eating. And in the late 1700s, when people were trying to get the French away from their fixation on bread as the staff of life, the French scientist and agronomist Parmentier tried to substitute potato starch for wheat flour in bread, and it was a complete failure. He got around this eventually by planting a great field of potatoes, setting armed guards around it, and then when the potatoes were ready for harvest, he removed the guards. And of course the peasants had all been watching this thing, which was obviously so valuable, and they all raced in and stole the potatoes and took them home and planted them.
In spite of its slow start, the potato eventually got out of the kitchen gardens and into the open fields. And as it reached those open fields, it once again changed the course of world history. Only this time it needed a little help from the governments. Somewhere around 1750, the ruling powers in Europe teamed up with the landowners and began pressuring the peasants to plant potatoes. They had realized that in spite of constant warfare and reoccurring famine, the potato would keep the peasants alive. And quite frankly, what is the point of being a king if you don't have peasants? At least 100 years before Columbus wandered into the Caribbean, Basque fishermen were harvesting cod just off the coast of Canada. On their way home, they would usually stop on the west coast of Ireland to dry their catch. As soon as the potato was introduced to Spain, the Basque fishermen began to put it aboard their ships. And sometime in the late 1500s or early 1600s, they introduced it to the west coast of Ireland. During the middle of the 1600s, when the Irish were fighting the English and were forced back to the west coast of Ireland, they learned to live on the potato.
The potato really thrived in the kind of very maritime ecology of Ireland. It needed seaweed, or it needed the animal dung. It fitted into a pastoral society, a society that had previously been very much dependent on things like butter, milk for the diet, at least in winter time. This was a society that had always boiled its food more than baked its food. And the potato slipped into that almost seamlessly in the 1600s. And I think this early success of the potato was because it didn't require a revolution either in cultivation methods or certainly in cooking habits. In other words, the pot inside which the potato was boiled had been there before the potato.
In 1650, the English, under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, sent troops to Ireland to put down a rebellion. Storehouses, mills, and fields were burned. It was in this setting that the value of the potato stood out. Potatoes grew underground in small wet plots that were difficult to burn. They stored safely and in concealed places within a farmer's cottage. They didn't need to be milled or processed. Planting didn't even require a plow. A family could plant an adequate crop using nothing more than a spade. The Irish were eventually defeated, but they weren't starved out. They were, however, forced off their land, which was given to Cromwell's veterans. The new English landlords concentrated on raising beef cattle and growing grain for export to Europe, and they used cheap Irish labor to get it done.
As the 17th century wore on, speculators who were only interested in making a buck ended up buying almost all of the land that had previously belonged to Cromwell's veterans. Raising cattle had always been a safety net for Irish farmers, but the speculators realized that the fastest way for them to make a buck was to raise cattle. They put an end to this kind of general farming and went for the beef. They'd raise it, ship it to Cork or Dublin for slaughter, and then for export. By the beginning of the 18th century, Ireland was Europe's largest exporter of beef.
The underpaid Irish labor force learned to make do on a diet of potatoes and milk. A single acre of potatoes and a single cow could feed an entire Irish family. And given the small amount of land still available for rent, it wasn't uncommon for an Irish family to find itself with only a single acre. And often that acre was owned by an English landlord.
The landowners and the landholders, the cattle owners, did relatively well, and indeed Ireland becomes a very successful food-producing economy for Britain in particular, in which it was dependent on a vast army of cheap labour. That cheap labour lived on the potato, but it did an awful lot of the work producing the food surpluses, pastoral, cereal food surpluses, that fed its industrial neighbour. Perhaps upwards of half the population by the 1830s, 1840s were agricultural labourers dependent on insecure employment and on a potato which turned out to be viciously insecure. But it is important to know that up until 45, up until the Great Hunger, the potato was probably more reliable year on year than other types of foodstuff like oats, rye, or wheat.
During the first half of the 19th century, tension between the English and the Irish continued to grow. The English passed a series of trade laws and tariffs that favored English industry and agriculture over the Irish, and Irish wages continued to drop even further. Trapped by both economics and politics, the Irish began living exclusively on potatoes. And when the potato crop failed in 1845, a famine followed that was truly disastrous.
The Great Hunger, or the Great Famine, is the largest event in modern Irish history, certainly up to the 20th century, in that 1/8 of the population inside of 6 years died. We have an excess mortality of about 1 million or a little over 1 million, and more than 1 million of Ireland's 8 immigrate between the beginnings of that famine and the early 1850s. An extraordinary artist come reporter who was working in London and working for the Illustrated London News produced a series of quite extraordinary images in 1846 and 47, and really he was the kind of the CNN of the Irish Great Hunger, because his images were coming through very quickly. They're quite small, but they bear very close examination, and there is extraordinary pathos in some of those faces. By the third or the fourth year of the famine, there's hardly a social group in Ireland, even among the very wealthiest, who weren't directly affected, partly because the diseases that associated with the famine did not recognize class barriers. But I think for the very poor, who depended entirely on the potato, the crisis was very real by the end of year one, in other words, by the fall of 1846.
The battle against potato blight is still going on. An Irish potato farmer, Jerry Flynn, is in the trenches.
Well, in the 1840s and 50s, if this was a field back then, there would be nothing left. It would be totally gone. And this is what the people were digging back in the famine. They had no sprays to combat the blight, and this was what they found when they dug up there. And that's what blight, actually there's spores on it there now. That's what blight would do to a perfectly good crop of potatoes in 2 days. Today's blight is blackleg, and we've no problem finding blackleg in this field because 60% of this crop is full of blackleg. These potatoes might look good, but because the infection, there's one of the potatoes there too were infected with blackleg, that will run through the plant. When that damp part hits off another potato, that infected area would hit off a perfectly good, that's not infected yet, perfectly good potato. Once it hits off that, it transfers the bacteria from that onto that. There's no chemicals, there's no cure, there's no seed treatment, there's absolutely nothing we can do for blackleg, only sunshine. It's like a cancer, everybody has it, but in a wet year it comes out. We're still fighting this battle against blight, and we're still losing.
English tariffs of the 1840s prevented the emergency importation of substitute grains. Relief efforts eventually got underway, but they were too little and too late. For many, there was no choice but to immigrate. By 1850, over 1 million people had left Ireland, with most immigrating to the United States. One of the distinguishing aspects of the immigration of the Irish to America is that there were almost the same number of men as women, and that allowed the immediate formation of families. The Irish-American community developed a strong identity from the moment they arrived in America.
Now, the Irish, of course, have been coming since the colonial period, but their biggest wave was certainly in the 19th century. And their contribution, one of their biggest contributions, was that they arrived in such huge numbers and really shocked America. Forced America to really think about what it meant to be an American, and then kind of expanded the definition. America was not particularly pleased with the arrival of the Irish, and gradually, over time, it took a couple generations, accepted them as Americans. You could look at something like the St. Patrick's Day Parade that is held all across the country now, every year on March 17th. It's a celebration of Irish identity, but it's been copied and replicated by every immigrant group since. Other contributions by the Irish, probably the most evident one, is in the role that they played in building the American economy as laborers. They came with very few skills, with almost no money for the most part, but they did arrive with the need to work and the willingness to work. And if you look across America, the great infrastructure that was built that made America the greatest economy in the world by the early 20th century, the railroads, the canals, the great projects like the Brooklyn Bridge, all were built overwhelmingly with Irish labor. Many other groups too, but Irish really were the key contributors to that development.
The potato doesn't make it into the upper class until after the French Revolution in the early 1800s. After they have fled France and their cooks have fled France because people like them were having their heads cut off, which is something nobody much cares for. And they fled to parts of Europe where potatoes were already the ordinary fare for every class of society. Switzerland and parts of Germany and the Low Countries and the British Isles. And so when everybody returned, the upper class knew how to eat potatoes and were used to them, and the chefs had learned how to cook them. One little clue that I have found is that the great chef Carême has a recipe in his cookbook, which he publishes in Paris, I think in 1815, for what he calls in his beautiful English, mèche potatoes, which I take to be mashed potatoes. You know, so it had everybody's blessing, and then it was all right even for the middle class to eat because the upper class was eating it.
During the 1800s, street vendors in Paris started offering slices of fried potato. They were shaped like a quarter moon and called Newbridge potatoes, after one of the bridges that crossed the River Seine. By 1870, they had made their way across the Channel to England, where they were put together with fried fish to create England's national fast food. At about the same time, they probably came over to the United States. What Americans call French fried potatoes are known as chips in England, and what we call chips in America are called crisps in England, which of course makes perfect sense when you remember that George Bernard Shaw pointed out that the Americans and the English are two peoples divided by a common language.
But the most important worldwide impact of the potato during the last 250 years is the way it allowed a small number of Northern European countries to build a military, political, and industrial base which allowed them to dominate the planet.
Take a look at a large-scale potato operation and you can see what was happening. Potatoes yield 2 to 4 times as much nourishment per acre as grain. As potatoes spread through Europe, a feedback process was set in motion. More potatoes produced more food. More food produced more people. More people produced more potatoes. The population of Northern Europe grew as fast as the potato plants. In fact, the rate of population growth in Northern Europe far outstripped what was taking place in other parts of the world. All across Europe, the potato became the staple food of the poor and the new working classes. It contributed to a population increase that was big enough to provide Europe not only with extra farm laborers, but with the workforce it needed for its transformation into an industrial society.
The expanding European population also filled the ranks of the imperial armies and navies, and their successes allowed Europeans to immigrate all over the world. The potato also fed the Russians and the Germans, and without the potato, it is highly unlikely that either of those countries would have become the industrial and military powers that they eventually became.
Fries, however, did not become very popular with Americans until the end of the First World War, when American troops returned from the French front with a love of French fries. Americans eat most of their potatoes in the form of the French fry. Each year, Americans consume over 30 pounds of French fries per person. They became even more popular during the 1930s when people started driving around the country in their own automobiles. Roadside restaurants began to serve fries because they were easily eaten in a car. At the end of the Second World War, there was a fantastic growth in the use of frozen foods, and the French fried potato became a major item in the new frozen food cases that were being introduced in supermarkets. They also became the most popular food item in the restaurant business. For decades, they have been the most profitable offering in fast food. The extraordinary healthful and nutritional value of the potato has made it a staple of the American and European diets for hundreds of years. In one form or another, potatoes have become part of virtually everyone's diet. This lesson has not been lost on the developing world. Today, the potato is catching on in Africa and Asia, where nations struggling to feed hundreds of thousands of hungry people have been turning to the potato. In South Asia and in some parts of Africa, potato consumption has replaced rice and millet. These days, Rwandans eat more potatoes than the Irish.
So there you have it, the story of the potato. It fed the great Inca Empire and the Spanish who conquered it. In Ireland, it tried to keep a starving population alive. In Northern Europe, it fed an expanding population which allowed a handful of countries to dominate the world for 200 years. It became a staple in Asia and Africa and the most profitable item on American restaurant menus. For What We Eat, I'm Burt Wolfe. On November 4th, 1492, Columbus came ashore on what is now the island of Cuba. The natives greeted him and gave him two gifts. One was tobacco and one was corn. His diary for the next day contained the following entry.
There was a great deal of tilled land sown with a sort of bean and a sort of grain they called maíz, which tasted good. It was baked or dried and made into flour. On one day, the American plants of corn and tobacco were introduced to the rest of the world. The Indians presented their corn to Columbus because it was a valuable food, but also because it was the basis of their civilization.
They used it for every possible food and for every possible sacred ceremonial use, because corn is at the heart of all the mythology, all the calendar, all the religions, all the rituals of Mesoamerica. The original word corn, maíz in Arawak, meant seed of life, because life in the created universe began with corn, with the corn gods, but it's really with the seed, the womb of life. Mother Earth was also Mother Corn, being fertilized really by the sun, by the heavens, by Father Sun. Out of that, the universe sprouts. But what sprouts? A corn tree. The corn tree becomes the axle of the universe. A corn plant, and all the cobs on that tree are heads of gods. So the corn god is represented in the plant. Man was created from a dough of corn and blood.
The Indians of Mesoamerica showed the Spanish how to grow and store corn. It was a strong plant, it traveled well, grew fast, provided plenty of food, and quickly spread throughout the world.
Corn is amazing in that it changed the way the world eats instantly, that it went around the world, which was after Columbus. And it, with great speed, it developed everywhere it went because it grows every place but the North and South Pole. So it has this capacity to adapt itself to all kinds of climates and ecologies and damp, dry, high, low. So first of all, it could grow everywhere. Secondly, it could be eaten by both men and animals. That's enormously important. Corn has ended up with this kind of double purpose as the world's best animal feed.
During the 1500s and 1600s, European farmers used oxen to clear their land and then planted their fields by scattering handfuls of grain over the earth. The grain started growing wherever they fell. Farmers waited for the weeds to come up with the crop, then pulled up the weeds. Native Americans had a very different approach. Before the arrival of the Europeans in America, there were no draft animals to help with the farming. Land was cleared by hand using a technique called slash and burn. The only tools available were axes and sticks and hoes with blades and points that were made of wood, seashells, deer antlers, and the shoulder blades of large animals.
When Europeans got to North America and Central America and South America, they were astounded at the way the Indians did agriculture. They found the Indians had made little mounds, like they had a checkerboard design, huge fields, miles and miles and miles in extent. And each little mound was exactly in its mathematical place in rows. And in the mound, the Indians would plant a few, always a sort of religious number, 4 or 6, grains in the mound. So this is all immaculately done. everything clean and clear.
Corn, beans, and squash were always planted together and eaten together.
The natives considered them three inseparable sisters, like the Supremes when they first got started. The corn would grow up, the beans would grow up around the corn stalk, and the squash would sit in the land between the corn, helping to hold down the weeds. In some places, they would plant a fish into the mound. It was considered sacred. If you didn't put in the fish, the corn refused to come up. Somehow the natives had figured out that the corn plant needed an enormous number of nutrients, and that the fish would supply those nutrients.
The Indians always ate corn, beans, and squash at the same time, and they always added a little burnt wood or burnt shell during the cooking.
And we now know that this was an incredibly intelligent thing to do, that if the Indians had not done that, corn would never have been their staple. Because corn is lacking in various nutrition ingredients, things that human beings need. Some of the things it hasn't got, and beans and squash add those. And other things, one particular thing, niacin, is in corn, but human beings can't digest it. So the Indians used to add ash to every pot of corn that they cooked. It's recently been discovered that that lime, which is what it is, alkali, that alkali loosened this essential vitamin niacin so that human beings can digest it. And it's extraordinary because the Indians used to offer corn to the gods, their sacred food, right? And they never added ash when they offered it to the gods. They somehow knew that it was human beings who needed the ash. The gods didn't need it.
If you try to live on corn alone, without the addition of beans, squash, and ash, you're going to end up undernourished and eventually develop a disease known as pellagra. In spite of the nutritional advantages of corn, however, it was never really accepted by the Europeans, and very few countries got it into their national cuisine. The French still think it's only fit for animals, and the Irish ignored it until they were almost starving.
The story of corn coming into Europe, it ricochets around the Mediterranean and it gets carried up the rivers and it finds the habitats where it can be happy. It displaces a grain that had been in very wide use since at least Roman times, and that's millet, which now survives in this country, I think, largely in birdseed mixtures. Though you can get it in health food stores, and I like to throw a handful of it into a soup sometimes just for old time's sake. But in northern Italy, where they had been making polenta for centuries, they'd been making it with millet. And one of the rules, really, for new foodstuffs coming in is if it looks like something you know, then try cooking it like the thing you know. And quite often that works. I think one of the things that has made it hard for Europeans to get used to the idea of eating corn is that they have absolutely no understanding there that there is a difference between field corn and sweet corn. And again, they would plant field corn and it worked fine if they ground it, but when they would try eating it, they would say it's fit only for animal fodder.
European settlers to North America quickly incorporated corn into their diet. It was easy to bake corn on a griddle. The result was a firm disc that could be carried on a journey, which is how they came to be called journey cakes, which eventually became Johnny cakes. Pone was the Indian word for corn batter cooked on hot stones. Whipped egg whites were added to produce a corn souffle called spoon bread. And coarsely ground white cornmeal was called grits. In Mexico, Central and South America, corn that had been ground into fine flour was baked into tortillas or fried to make enchiladas.
The corn that the Mexicans use that was brought to Europe is very bland. It isn't like our sweet corn. It isn't that tasty. The tortilla was a way of making it a little more tasty and more palatable, and of course making it into a bread, basically. Only women in Mexico know how to make tortillas in villages. And the interesting thing is that the Cortes did not have a woman with him when he went to Mexico. So what happened was that none of his guys learned how to make tortillas. So they brought back the corn, they brought back the world's stalest tortillas after, I don't know, a month on the sea, but they didn't bring back the magic formula to make that corn into such a tasty thing that the Mexicans have. So I don't think this is the whole account, but I think part of it is that the Europeans didn't get corn the way Mexicans were eating it because of the absence of a culinarily oriented person, i.e. woman.
If you look up the word corn in a dictionary, you will find that it is used to describe the primary grain of a country. If you make your daily bread in wheat, then wheat is your corn. Rye is the corn of Sweden. Oats are the corn of Ireland. When the first English-speaking colonists arrived in the New World, they realized that the Native American Indians were using maize, and so they called maize Indian corn. Maize is a giant grass which produces very large seeds. Each kernel is really a fruit with an oily seed surrounded by starchy nutrients that are held in a hull. The corn cob and its seed is covered with a husk, which makes it easy to harvest, easy to feed to livestock, easy to transport, and easy to store. It could be considered as one of the original packaged foods.
Of the three staples of the world, wheat, rice, and corn, they're all from the same family of grasses. That's what we mean by cereal grains. The reason they are staples is that they can be dried and then you can eat them in the wintertime. So it's not just spring, but corn is the only one that you can eat also fresh as a vegetable because you eat those seeds from the seed pod, which is the ear of corn. We're the only country in the world to really develop sweet corn. We're the only people who want corn on the cob, consider that a delicacy, a treat, a necessity for summer.
Corn sounds like the most perfect plant on the planet. So what's the problem? As so often the case in relationships, it's sex. The husk on corn is so strong and so tight that it can't seat itself.
We have this unbelievable plant which has all these soft kernels side by side stuck in a cob with a sheath covering them all. They are close together, they are tightly held to the cob, and the sheath cannot be removed by nature. If you let it lie on the ground, it would just rot, and that's the end of it. Even if you took the sheath off and threw it on the ground, it would not grow. So corn absolutely and totally depends on human beings to survive.
Today there are 6 major varieties of corn. The oldest is popcorn. Popcorn has a hard hull. When it's heated, the starch inside the skin of the kernel fills with steam until it bursts. With other types of corn, the steam leaks out, which is why they don't pop. Some historians believe that the accidental popping of a hard grain in a fire gave ancient man, or more likely ancient woman, the idea that cereals were edible.
You have the popcorn beginning as an important American product in New England about 1820, 1830, and it becomes the celebrity product of this time with Henry David Thoreau popping corn and writing about it in his journal, and Emerson saying it's a wonderful thing to give to the kiddies at Christmas time. It gets them away from the adults. And you have all these other great Americans talking about the importance of popcorn, which they all consider to be something new and exciting. So it enters into America from the top down. When the Depression comes, all of a sudden movie owners are confronted with going out of business, or establishing a new revenue stream. And by far, you make the most amount of money as a snack out of popcorn. And the price of admission was decreased so that they would get people in, so that they would buy popcorn, so the theaters could make money.
Hello, I'm Orville Redenbacher. If you've got
The
40 years
superhero of popcorn, however, was Orville Redenbacher. Orville was an agricultural extension agent in Indiana who came up with a kernel that popped bigger than any kernel had ever popped. 50 times bigger than the kernel. Until then, kernels had only popped up to 35 or 40 times their size.
I'd suggest you start with a corn patch. You want to try about 500,000 cross-pollinations.
Popcorn is one of the few foods that's purchased by weight. So if you increase the volume, you increase your sales. And consequently, Orville Redenbacher concluded this was something that was going to revolutionize the popcorn business. He decided that he needed some marketing help. He hired a public relations firm in Chicago, paid them $18,000, and said, I need help with a for about